Victor Davis Hanson is a fellow at the Hoover Institution, and he joins us now. VDH, great to see you. I usually talk to you on the radio. How you doing?
Pretty good. Thank you for having me, Laura.
So we got into the China issue, of course, is one of my favorite issues. Here we are, perhaps on the verge of war with North Korea, the one country that could really, in a matter of maybe a day or two, change the calculus. And they went a little bit farther, but are you persuaded by Nikki Haley's, triumphant, they changed the tone comment she made?
No, I'm happy they had some UN sanctions only because it drives a wedge, a little wedge at least, between Russia and China and North Korea. North Korea's propaganda minister called them riffraff today. That's some help. But ultimately, China's the only country, as you said, that can pressure North Korea, and we're the only country that can pressure China. And if it's intolerable to threaten Seoul by a preemptive strike, and it's intolerable to allow them to have missiles that could take out Facebook, Google, and Apple within 45 minutes and the million people that live around them in Menlo Park, then we have to find a new strategy to escalate gradually up into in between those poles. And I don't see why Chinese, the apparat and the elites of China, why do they still get to buy property in the United States? Why do they still send their kids to Caltech and Stanford? Why don't we have a missile defense system that includes Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, that not only deters North Korea, but a first strike ability of China? That would get their attention.
Yeah,
and
but
finally,
go ahead.
Yeah, finally, I mean, China is not in such a great position. They have 4 nuclear powers on their border: India, Pakistan, Russia, and North Korea. They're not always predictable. Do they really want another 2 with Japan and South Korea? And we have to introduce that, because I don't think that China would like South Korea talking the way North Korea does about our West Coast.
Imagine what would China do, Victor, if the shoe were on the other foot and it was a South Korean leader who was threatening with the same type of force what North Korea is doing?
Well, we know what they do. No, they wouldn't put up with it, because we know what they would do. They're in a dispute right now in the Himalayas with India, and they're talking as North Korea does. They're completely furious, and we have to get their attention. It's also a reminder, by the way, that deterrence is very hard to achieve, and it's squandered very easily. So when the last 8 years, when we had red lines and step over lines and deadlines that didn't mean anything, and withdrawing from Iraq precipitously, letting the Spratly Islands mess take hold, people got the wrong impression that we were militarily weak, and wars are sometimes started by weak powers that miscalculate, and that's what North Korea is doing. And we don't need a president anymore in a hot mic conversation talking about being flexible on missile defense, even in a different context. So we've got to restore deterrence, and I do think that we're very lucky in one sense that with all the controversy over our generals, that McMaster and Mattis and Kelly and Tillerson, nobody knows more about global commerce, and the combination of these 4, and we got a guy like Pompeo at CIA, so we've got a very good team to help Trump, and I think that they're going to find a solution that something short of the left's idea that you can live with the West Coast in range of a nuclear missile, sort of like
they're now
Mao's
threatening
China.
Guam. Is the Guam thing real, Victor?
I don't know. We don't know. But I know one thing, that as we're working this thing out, Iran is watching this, and it's a laboratory of their own trajectory, and they're thinking what is going to work with North Korea will work with us. So if we don't find a solution short of war, then we're going to be helpless with Iran. And I think there are these increasing steps that we can make it painful for China. We got to get rid of the idea, Laura, that it's not in their self-interest. This is a diabolical move to bifurcate the United States and South Korea, because suddenly, for the first time in 70 years, we're saying to South Korea, you may want to pursue a sunshine policy or whatever it is, but we have different interests now. It's called the West Coast. It's not just Seoul anymore.
And
that's what North Korea did to us, and we need to do something like that and bifurcate North Korea from China.
It would be nice if we actually had a bipartisan consensus that China represents a bigger threat to the United States, national security threat, than Russia. That would be nice if people actually contemplated that for a moment.
I think you're exactly right about Russia, because we lost an opportunity to Nixon and Kissinger triangulated with China, Russia. It's not that we can chew gum at the same time and have 2 adversaries. We don't want 2 adversaries.
No, we want fewer
Russia
adversaries.
pitted against China.
Yeah, exactly. Why not drive a wedge between the two of them? I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Professor Hanson, thank you so much.
We never really made it, baby, but we came pretty close. Adios, adios.
Americans should sleep well at night, have no concerns about this particular rhetoric of the last few days. I think the president, again, as commander-in-chief, I think he felt it necessary to issue a very strong statement directly to North Korea. But I think what the president was just reaffirming is the United States has the capability to fully defend itself from any attack and defend our allies, and we will do so.
You are listening to the Laura Ingraham Show. Rex Tillerson clearly downplaying Trump's rhetoric. So when he said basically pay no attention to the rhetoric, he's talking about the commander-in-chief, I guess. That's an interesting scenario. That was wild. One of our best guests last night, of course, when I hosted for Tucker, was Victor Davis Hanson, of course, who's in really one of the greatest, in my mind, minds and thinkers on the history of the Korean Peninsula, how we have to always remember history as we face these challenges that we're looking at today, and reminding us of how things can spin out of control very quickly to China's benefit. And he joins us now. VDH, how are you? Good to talk to you.
Very good. Thanks for having me again.
Absolutely. Give us your sense first about Tillerson seeming to tamp down the commander-in-chief's rhetoric from yesterday, as it looked like we were coming closer to war after the North Korean dictator made the threat against Guam.
I think it's sort of the bad cop, good cop, that Trump sort of within parameters says things that are, unpredictable and erratic, and then his good cop people like Mattis and McMaster or Tillerson tell our allies or the world, look, this is what we got a guy who's really angry at you. It's sort of like Nixon and Kissinger did. They did the same thing, and it's sort of throughout history. It's a successful formula as long as Trump doesn't say something that is interpreted as a red line or a step over line or a deadline, and then he doesn't follow through, and then it becomes bluster. But as long as he's vague, I think it's okay. We've had Bill Clinton said the same thing. He said that a war with North Korea would end in its destruction. And William Perry, of all people, I know he says something different now, but he said we should take out the missiles as they're launched. He said that about 8 years ago. So this is nothing new, even though the media thinks it is.
Well, when we recall what happened in the Korean War, we lost, they initially said we lost 54,000 people. They revised it downward to 33,000. We had thousands horrible injuries. Obviously, in real dollar terms, it was up $64 billion today. It would, be up in the hundreds of billions. What do we need to remember about how precarious it would be for our involvement in another military conflict there?
Well, we forget sometimes that North Korea borders Russia and China, and it's right near our ally Japan and Taiwan. So we've got interest and enemies and rivals in the whole area, and it's a long way from the United States. So in the Korean War, our biggest problem was trying to protect a vulnerable Japan, while Russia and China were sending material. In the case of both, Russia was sending manpower and aircraft defense and pilots, as well as China's million-man army. So it was very easy for them to supply the North Koreans and very difficult for us. So it's a very distant part of the world. One good thing is, though, from the Korean War is that China learned that it was a very bad thing for them to get involved with the United States and Korea. We forget that, but archives have shown they lost almost 1 million people, and the Red Army was terribly beaten by the United States, and that had a traumatic effect on them, and one of the reasons they didn't intervene in Vietnam. So they don't want to get too involved in it, and they're playing a game of chicken as to how long is this in a cost-benefit analysis helping China. And we've got to change the odds so they decide that they see it's a cul-de-sac and they stop. And the only way they're going to do that is when the price is too high to pay, and we haven't upped the ante yet.
Well, I think that China has grown more powerful year after year over the last 20 years, certainly since they joined the World Trade Organization, haven't really fired a shot in any of these conflicts that we've gotten mired in. And would they get any benefit, just to play devil's advocate, would they get any benefit from America at war with North Korea? And what would it be?
I don't think they would in a real existential war, but they don't feel that's going to happen. They feel that they get a lot of benefit from getting up to that point. We get rattled. We have to put resources in Korea. We disperse our strength. We have to beg their help. They can show the world that they're a sober and judicious player and resolve. They get a lot of it out of what's going on now, but not much out of it if it escalates. They have some problems, though, that we're not exploiting. They've got a really angry India at them over border disputes. And I don't know why we alienated Russia to the extent that we couldn't have used them to triangulate against China. We've got a nuclear card with Japan and South Korea. So they're in a really rough neighborhood with a lot of people around them that are nuclear and powerful, or could be nuclear and powerful, both, and they don't like China. And yet we don't seem to be developing a back channel with Russia, or we don't seem to be making announcements that we support India and its struggles with China. Any of those statements would really shock the Chinese, and I think we're going to see something like that, I hope, pretty soon.
Well, and the president has been, I think, so buffeted by this Mueller investigation. It has had ripple effects into our foreign policy. We saw that with the bum's rush on these Russian sanctions in Congress, which, frankly, were ridiculous. And then the president kind of reluctantly signed on to this and criticized it. So you're right, we alienate Russia further, and we lose an opportunity to have some type of at least alliance of convenience with Russia to put the big squeeze on China to say, you're the only one who could stop this. You're the only one who could really choke North Korea off, and we're going to use the leverage we have in trade and in other ways to get China to do what they really don't want to do, which is to lose billions of dollars in their trade with North Korea. But now we don't really have that option.
No, you're right, and that point is never made about the hysterical left, that in their zeal to redeem themselves or find some explanation for the inexplicable loss, they really alienated and demonized Russia to such a degree that it's not useful anymore in a way that it could have been in this crisis. They're really culpable for that. And we've got to find ways to pressure China, as we've said, and one way is pressuring Chinese individuals in the party not to come here or not buy property. Another is to raise the nuclear card. We've got to talk more about Taiwan and missile defense.
Bingo. Victor Davis Hanson, we could talk to you for an hour. Thank you so much for your perspective, as always. When we come back, Pat Buchanan.
The armed forces of the Republic of Korea, buttressed by the United States, they are no match for that, and they understand that. And that's why this nuclear capability, which they will not give up, is their ticket to survival. So they're not going to give up those nuclear weapons. I think we need to talk to them, we need to have dialogue with them, but accept the fact that they are a nuclear power.
James Clapper, former Director of National Intelligence for Obama. We just have to live with it. North Korea is going to be a nuclear power, and there's no way to stop it. Joining us now, Pat Buchanan. And Pat, you remember the going was good back in the 1950s, 1950, 51, 52.
The 40s weren't too bad either.
Yeah. Well, the Korean War was pretty rough, and Eisenhower ran for president in large part to end the war in Korea. And he left office as one of the most popular Republican presidents ever, and in large part because he brought peace to the United States. No one wanted to stay in that war. He got us out of that war, and that was a big part of the campaign, big part of his election appeal. And now it looks like, at least yesterday, we were edging closer to a war that would end in the deaths of perhaps millions of people.
Well, I recall that very well. I was in a hospital, frankly, had a broken leg and was in traction and body cast for 3 months.
Wow.
And this was back in 1960 when the war began. And as I told folks, my mother would bring me newspapers and magazines every day because you're lying on your back in that hospital. And I said at one point I knew the battlefield better than MacArthur, from just reading. But let me say this about Eisenhower. Truman left office as the least popular president almost in American history. And I came in and said he would go to Korea, which in effect meant he would end the war.
Right.
And it is said that Ike ended the war by giving a quiet threat that if the Chinese and the others did not conclude a truce or armistice along the DMZ where we were at that point, that he would take off limits on all weapons we used, which was a signal we might go to nuclear weapons. And China had none then, and of course North Korea had none then. And I think the Chinese, the Russians, and the North Koreans concluded they had bled America as much as they were going to be able to do. But you're exactly right. Eisenhower refused to intervene in Hungary during the revolution. I remember that very well. I was in college, and people were up in arms saying, do something about this horror that's going on. And Ike ended his administration as one of the most popular presidents in history. It was a time of peace and prosperity, and the 50s were by and large good times in America.
I thought after the president's comments yesterday that a lot of the neoconservatives would be pretty happy, because they always seem happy when we're off to war. I mean, they just seem like they're happy. They're happy warriors, but most of them, with the exception of people like McCain, weren't actually in battle. But nevertheless, John McCain yesterday came out and criticized the president, in part saying this.
I don't believe that President Reagan or President Eisenhower or other presidents that I've admired would have said the same thing. They might have done as much as we could, but not that kind of rhetoric. I'm not sure how it helps.
What do you think's going on there, Pat?
Well, let me say this on the neocons and McCain. On this one, I do agree with McCain. Rare agreement with John on this one. I don't think the fire and fury statement added anything. But let me say this: the neocons, I don't think are terribly excited about a war in Asia. Really, they got their gun sights right now. They're very anti-Russian, and they're, of course, got their gun sights on Iran. And this would be if you get into a war in Korea, it could be a horrendous thing. And I don't think the neocons want that any more than anyone else does, to be candid. But I do think that earlier you had somebody on, was it Clapper, saying that we're going to have to live with a nuclear North Korea. Well, remember Bush in 2002 in that dreadful speech, the axis of evil said the world's worst nations are not going to be, or worst regimes are not going to be allowed to get the world's worst weapons. And North Korea proceeded to build and test a nuclear weapon. They are a nuclear power. They do have nuclear weapons. The question at issue is whether the United States is going to tolerate and live with the ability of the North Koreans to deliver a nuclear weapon on American territory, not just American territory like Guam, but the American homeland, Anchorage, Alaska, the west coast of the United States, Denver, and Chicago. And McMaster says Trump will not tolerate that, and that is utterly unacceptable. But I think North Korea has decided this, Laura, that the only way they can guarantee the Americans don't attack them and bring down their regime is if they have a nuclear deterrent. That Saddam didn't have one, and look what happened to him, and Gaddafi didn't have one, and look what happened to him. And so they are determined to build this deterrent, and I don't think, absent of military action, we're going to be able to prevent them from doing so.
Mm-hmm. Well, Pat, let's reflect on how we lost leverage against China vis-a-vis North Korea, and how we could perhaps regain some leverage, knowing that without China, North Korea couldn't do what North Korea is doing. They are many just say they're the puppet of China in many ways. And so we did this World Trade Organization deal and Bill Clinton and Alan Greenspan and all these Republicans were all excited because there's going to be a new era of trade with China. China became more powerful year after year. We saw that over the last 8 years of Obama. From 2009 to 2016, China gained in strength, military, technological strength, weapons and space, all the advances they've made. And now we're sitting here having to, I guess, perhaps tolerate a real nuclear North Korea. And we're either not going to exercise our remaining leverage against China, or we can't. Or we help create this dynamic by enriching China and isolating Russia, as Victor Davis Hanson just said on the show.
You are exactly right. The United States and the Republican Party in particular, in the 1990s, when some of us were arguing, look, do not give them MFN, do not let them build up these trade surpluses. China is running an annual trade surplus in goods somewhere between 400 and 500 billion a year with the United States. They've gone from the size of Italy's economy at the turn of the century to an economy that is big as the United States, and their manufacturing base is larger, and that's being translated into military power, naval power, air power, nuclear power, and also a foreign policy of expansionism all through Asia and the One Belt, One Road strategy all the way into Central Asia and toward Europe. But here's where you are correct also, and that is that China does have the ability basically to strangle North Korea to death in terms of oil and in terms of not buying its coal and its exports, and secondly, in terms of not allowing imports or exports to go into North Korea. They would risk bringing down the North Korean regime. They would really imperil it. But I believe this. China is playing a game here. They are getting the benefit of North Korea's threats and its building of nuclear weapons, because those threats are forcing South Korea to say, look, the Americans going to protect us? The Americans are nervous themselves. Are they going to protect us? So North Korea is driving a wedge between South Korea and the United States. It's also pushing a lot of folks in the United States to say, get our troops off that peninsula, move them offshore. And so North Korea, in a way, is doing the work of China. At the same time, China does not want, I don't believe China wants a war. So they're playing a very touchy game here, and they're playing it very well. But the truth is that Trump is correct here. The Chinese could squeeze North Korea to death. I don't believe they want to. I don't believe they will.
No, we already would have.
They're using them as a cat's paw.
Right. You could say they're the puppet. They're a convenient wedge. And it's very useful to China to have America mired in another conflict, whether we're on the brink of the conflict or we actually get into a horrific military struggle. China doesn't fire a shot year after year after year. They don't have any of these wars that we have, and they get stronger and stronger and stronger. All they do is focus on the home front, expanding their influence. And is there any scenario, Pat, where you think China could come in and say, okay, guys, we're not gonna tolerate this, but we have our own conditions. These are the conditions that we have.
The question is, you're exactly right. I mean, look at all these crazed Middle East wars we're in. The Chinese just observe that and stay out. They're build up their strength. The Americans have been fighting in 6, 7 countries, if you throw in Somalia and the others, in the last 15 years. We're all bogged down there. But here's the thing. The Chinese, I think, believe, and I believe correctly, that in the longer term, just as they've grown from the size of Italy to the size of the United States in 17 years, the future belongs to them if they stay out of a war with the United States, the kind of war between the two greatest powers that Germany and Britain failed to stay out of in the first half of the 20th century. So at the same time, I think they want to maintain North Korea. But I tell you, if the game goes to the point where there's a possibility of a real war, which could very quickly go nuclear, whether the North Koreans got missiles that can reach us or not, I can't believe North Korea would go down fighting without using everything in its arsenal, including nuclear weapons. The Chinese got to ask themselves, do they really want something like that to occur right next door to them and have the Korean Peninsula just on fire and millions of refugees and the whole world divided between China and the United States? I think the Chinese would like the current situation to continue on with the U.S. distracted and problems here in the U.S.
But Pat, what I'm saying is, couldn't they broker the peace or a tolerable peace?
I don't know that they can. I think that unless the North Koreans are faking it, they've been very insulting to China. Kim Jong-un, to my understanding, has never visited China. He's been in power 4 or 5 years. Never visited there. They realize they got a problem child on their hands with nuclear weapons, and it's a tough situation to manage. But they've been managing it well.
We're not gonna have an Incheon landing. I can tell you that. We're not gonna be back to Chosin Reservoir. That's not how this war is gonna be fought. My friends. I mean, I have my surrogate dad, Chuck Carlson, fought in the Korean War, and I can't wait to talk to him because he's like, okay, let me tell you how it really was. And I feel it's this idea that we're gonna be fighting this romantic war. That's over. That's just not going to happen. Pat Buchanan, always great to talk to you. Thanks for your perspective, historical and otherwise political. We'll check back with you soon. We'll take a break. Don't go away.
The Laura Ingraham Show.
At a conservative summit in Denver recently, military historian and author Victor Davis Hanson spoke about what he called, quote, the moral bankruptcy of liberalism. He was speaking at the annual...
Now, when I think of the words moral bankruptcy of liberalism, I think of a couple of things. I think of $17 trillion in debt. I think of a government that uses its IRS agents to go after its opponents. And I also think of Carlos Danger, a.k.a. Anthony Weiner. I know, however, that these things are just symptoms of a deeper rot. And one of the advantages of having an eminent historian is that we can look back at some of the things that have actually caused our present dangers. I'm reminded of the quote by Winston Churchill that the longer we look back, the farther we can look ahead. And so I'm excited today to talk to you about the moral bankruptcy of liberalism. I think of Rome, and I know you've spent a lot of time in Rome and studying Rome. They say that Rome was not built in a day. It certainly did not fall in a day. Can we draw some comparisons between the fall of Rome and some of the bankruptcy and degradation here in our country?
Well, obviously we can. I wouldn't be asked that question. It's hard to screw, if I could use the vernacular, it's hard to screw up a system that's viable and logical and works within a generation. But the problems that imploded in the West and Rome in the 5th century AD were known as early as the 1st century AD, and they're unfortunately too familiar to all of us. And that is, the poet Juvenal called them bread and circuses. But what he meant by that was that more and more people became dependent on a redistributive government, and after there were no more provinces to acquire or to find newfound riches, it became a predatory economy, a parasitical economy. So people talked about fairness, not growth in the economy, not creation of new wealth, but static wealth. And my experience as a historian is when you go through history, whether it's 5th century Athens or Imperial Rome, or England Britain after the war, and you hear the elites talk about not being fair, or that, as the president said the other day, the problem is not unemployment, or it's not the deficit or the debt, but it's CEO compensation. That's what he fixated on. It tells you that we're in a mode right now that the pie is static, peasant mentality that's not going to grow, and you have to slice it up in different ways that are more equal. It reminds me, if somebody has a Kia today, it's a much better car than a Mercedes 20 years ago in terms of air conditioning, reliability. It's a beautiful car. But in this way of thinking, it's not fair that somebody doesn't have a Mercedes. If you tell him his Kia or your iPhone is much better than what anybody had 20 years, it doesn't matter. So it's not absolute good or evil or wealth or poverty, but it's relative. And this is really disturbing in history, you see, because people from Plato to Tocqueville warned us that the illogical consequences of democracy would be radical equality of result rather than opportunity that would destroy liberty. And our founding fathers thought, wow, how can we be the exception to what Rome and Athens and France? So they came up with all these bizarre things that the left really hated: the electoral college, vetoes, balance of power, even the indirect election of senators in the beginning. And you can see that in most of the thinking today, the therapeutic thinking of liberals, they see liberty and individualism as somehow an impediment to radical egalitarianism. That's where we are, and I think the government's the only mechanism that can ensure that we're all equal on the outside rather than in the beginning.
With these redistributionist policies, I think it's easy to focus on the unfairness of taking from one person and giving to another. But I think there's a sort of a deeper problem that the entitlement mentality, inculcating envy in people, actually sort of is damaging to the soul and damaging to the moral fabric of a country. And I think you alluded to that in saying, you tell people that a Kia is not good enough, they should get a Mercedes. Do you see that at work in this country?
I think that's the driving ideology. If you would, we've become so attuned, so accustomed to it that nobody finds it shocking anymore that the President of the United States doesn't just say spread the wealth, but now we're to another level. You didn't build that, it's not time to profit, CEOs, corporate jet owners, et cetera, and you collate everything he said, and you get the impression that success, capital, it's not only that it enriches everybody, but that there's something suspect about a person who's well off. How did he do that? It's almost like Balzac said, behind every fortune there's a crime. But the problem with this is, and I think what bothers most of you in this room, is not just traditional class envy, but something that's new. It's always been there with the left, but with Obama it really came out, and that is there's going to be a self-appointed elite technocracy. People like Timothy Geithner, Eric Holder, Barack Obama, that have been certified by our best schools. And two things we have to remember about this technocracy, sort of like Plato's guardians, but much worse. One is they're not subject to the same ramifications of their own ideology that we are. So they can go to Costa del Sol or Martha's Vineyard, that's okay. And the law is flexible and fluid. That's very dangerous. It's not absolute. The law is a means to a noble end. So if Obama is better than the rest of us and has a better vision, then he really doesn't have to follow the Obamacare mandate, or he really can go after Boeing, or he can give amnesty to 1.7 million illegal aliens because his intentions and his goals are supposedly much better than ours. That's very dangerous when you get away from the rule of absolute law.
One of the countries or one of the ancient civilizations that I find most fascinating is the Byzantine Empire. A lot of people maybe don't know, but they actually preserved Western civilization for a good 1,000 years. And if you go and see the walls in modern-day Istanbul, they're like 20 feet thick. So you can't help but wonder, was this country overrun from the outside, or did it crumble from the inside? And as a military historian and a general historian as well, that sort of confluence of threats from outside as well as threats from within, how do you see that at work on our walls of civilization?
Well, every great society has enemies, foreign and domestic, but the question is why at a particular time in their history are those enemies superior to them when they weren't in the past? Why does Rome, when it's only 1/4 of Italy in the Second Punic War, destroy Hannibal, who's an authentic military genius, and yet when it has 70 million people and 1 million square miles, it can't stop a thug like the Viscos or the Goths? And the answer is there's something changes within. When you go to Byzantium, it's kind of an aberration. How did Western civilization, Christianity, survive in that hostile climate in the East for 1,000 years after the fall of the West? So that Black Tuesday is what we say in Greece today of May 29th, 1453. And I think the answer is that what kept Byzantium alive was not their material riches, but people believed in a transcendence. In this case, it was Christianity, the Hellenic language, and Western civilization. They didn't think it was perfect, but they thought it was better than the alternative outside the Byzantine Empire, whether it was the Seljuk Turks, later the Ottomans, the Huns, whoever they were. They thought they were better than the alternative, and they were willing to make enormous sacrifices and articulate that again and again. But when a society gets into a Howard Zinn mode, to quote one historian that's been in the news lately, and doesn't believe that the United States is not just not exceptional, but is no better than the alternative, then history's unforgiving. It kind of comes out of nowhere and says, if you don't believe that you're better than all alternative, nobody else will, and there's no reason for you to continue. And it has to be replenished psychologically. And so all of you in this room, we have a duty, each according to our station. Each day we have to say to ourselves, the United States is better than the alternative, and what in my own way can I do to remind people of that? And I'm not going to be silent about it. And then we have to have an element of the tragic hero within us. You know, we all love the Western Shane or the Magnificent Seven or High Noon, but they all have one theme, don't they? That the tragic hero says, I'm going to do the right thing, but by doing the right thing, people are going to hate me, and they're not going to even want me around when I've done the right thing. And so criticizing what's going on in this country is going to earn you wages that are very unfortunate, but if you don't want to earn them, then we're going to lose the country, it seems to me.
Now, during that great final battle for the heart and soul and the land of the Byzantine Empire, someone left a door open in the inner gate, which I think hastened the end of the battle in favor of the Turks. I get the impression that, in a sense, we are also leaving the door open in this country with our porous borders and the fact that we don't keep track of our visa overstayers. And you've written about this in Mexifornia, A State of Becoming, about sort of leaving the door open to our southern border and how we have millions of people who have not assimilated into our culture, and that in fact has an effect on the fabric of our nation.
Well, we've always had immigration. I'm reading a fascinating book by our prior speaker that's in galley proof that I'm reviewing, Michael Barone. It's an excellent book, and he tries to remind us the Irish, the Jews, Eastern Europeans, and there's much truth to that. But I think in the book he's worried, and perhaps all of us are worried, that for immigration to work in the United States, it traditionally has had to be legal. And we traditionally had to have a melting pot, and we traditionally had to believe in the powers of assimilation, integration, and intermarriage. And we've never had a proximate country with such a long 1,700-mile border, which is the sole source. There's a lot of reasons that can explain why Mexico, after 1970, started to export its people, but it wouldn't have mattered. It was in here, as you say, the door was open. Any issue that unites the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal and the Voice of Aztlan is a very strange issue. But they have one thing in common. It's not left or right, as you see with a Gang of Eight, Democratic or Republican, but it's elite versus the mass. The average people of all persuasions are skeptical, because if they're a worker, I talked to a Hispanic worker and he says, why does my leadership want this amnesty when for the first time in my life, I'm making $11 an hour. I don't want my wages undercut by people from Mexico. It's been terrible for American workers. It's the Democratic and La Raza elite want a unassimilated constituency that's replenished every year by 300,000 or 400,000 that ensures that demographics change and that they can be spokesmen for group grievances rather than individuals. People's character, their race will never be incidental to their character. It'll always be essential. If you keep bringing people in that can't achieve parity in one or two generations, employers, as I said, want cheap labor, access to it. And then they dress it all up with this utopian caring, when in fact it's one of the most amoral, uncaring phenomenon in the world. It's bad for American poor. It destroys the concept of the rule of law. If all of you have to file a tax return on a particular date, is that a negotiable phenomenon? Can you say, I sort of kind of would like to pay it, but I really don't want to, as if an immigration law or an IRS law is something up for discussion? Who is to say, when you start destroying the law or the sanctity of the law, that you can pick and choose which other laws people have to follow? And we've seen that already with the erosion of federal immigration law. So I'm worried about it, and I'm confident that if we would shut the border
and we would deport the people who have committed crimes, who have just arrived in expectation of amnesty, and who are on public assistance. There would be still a majority that we could work with. We could give them green cards and have a path to amnesty. But when I look at this Gang of Eight bill, that's not what it's about. It's about a DREAM Act, but there's no UNDREAM Act with it. We're talking about giving people amnesty, but not one senator has the integrity to get up and said, I will give amnesty or a path of citizenship to person A, but person B is not going to get it, and this is why, and they're not going to get it first before I give it to A, because that's politically incorrect.
So, picking what laws we choose to enforce is really an assault on the concept of rule of law. And we talked a little bit backstage about some of the things that this administration has done in just ignoring the law, like, oh, the law says this, well, we're not really going to do that. And I'm thinking No Child Left Behind, I'm thinking immigration law, I'm thinking Obamacare. I mean, it's a relief in some ways that part of it's, going to be on hold for a year, but there's also, it speaks to the rule of law that, if you're executing the laws, you can't just say, hey, I don't feel like doing this.
Yeah, I think that's why the Founding Fathers, who were well-versed...
Victor, excuse me, before you take that rule of law question, can we get the texting slide? We're going to do the texting for some questions a little differently here.
Okay.
You're going to be able to see them go on the screen.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, if it was just up, forgive me, but there it is again. And text your questions with that code number. For both Arizona and Colorado, we're on an equal footing. And we'll go to your questions in a few minutes, but this is a great one from Krista Kafer about rule of law. Excuse me, Victor.
Oh, go ahead and answer my question. I'll take the speaker's prerogative. We'll go first.
Okay. Well, I think when we look around, the law has become fluid, and this is exactly what the founders were worried about, because they looked at Athens versus Rome. Rome was a constitutional republic. Athens was ruled what 51% of the people thought on any given day, and right after the founders expressed these worries, we had the French Revolution and this idea of fraternity and egalitarianism enforced by what 51% of the people want. That's not constitutional or consensual government. And so what do we look at with this president? If Boeing wants to put a plant in South Carolina, the National Labor Relations Board can try to shut it down. They can shut down a small guitar company. Don't enforce the individual mandate. Give 1.7 million people amnesty right before the election. So the idea again is that the law is not an abstract or a final or a legislative product, but it's predicated critical legal theory on what 51% are perceived to want and purposes of social justice. So if Eric Holder thinks that the Black Panthers may or may not have disrupted a polling booth, it won't matter, because their aims are egalitarianism and fairness, and they have a history of oppression, he thinks. Therefore, the law is secondary. And that's what, same thing with the Trayvon Martin case. A judge, I know I'll be in a little bit of controversy here, but the proverbial culpable white male was not involved in that case. There was somebody of mixed Latino heritage in an altercation with an African-American, adjudicated by an all-female judge, jury overseen by a female judge, and yet the politicalization turned that into a sort of racial issue when it was not. And the idea of a president commenting as that trial was going, it hadn't even been adjudicated, and after it was being adjudicated and it was subject to a civil rights investigation, then to comment again about the appearance. I think all of you would be shocked if Bill Clinton had said right in the middle of the OJ trial, wow, Nicole Simpson looks like the second daughter I never had. That would be horrible to say that, because it would influence the jury. So we're seeing things in the law that we haven't seen.
Yeah, it seems to me that the difference between a country based on rule of law and one that sort of does whatever it feels like is the difference between, I don't know, us and a southern neighbor, Cuba, perhaps other countries where despotism rules the day. We have a very interesting question from Patrick McKinney from Albuquerque. He says that in 300 years from now, how will historians summarize what happened to the United States in 2013? Can you look back in order to look forward and answer that question?
Well, for this occasion, I'm not going to be empirical, but I'm going to be hopeful. And I'm going to suggest that people are going to look back and say this was the perfect storm of the left. They got everything they wanted. They had a House and a Democratic Senate from 2006. They got the first African-American post-racial transcendental candidate that pushed every liberal button. Very popular, very eloquent speaker, very skilled in teleprompted rhetoric. So, and they came in after a terrible meltdown, the 2008 meltdown in September, which destroyed the 3-point lead of McCain and Palin. They came in an unpopular war. Everything lined up. There was no incumbent from the first time since 1952. It was an orphaned election. No incumbent, by that I mean vice president or president. Everything was on the left. And here we are, fast forward 5 years later, with sinking polls and a nation that's in turmoil. And I think that suggests that America is exceptional, and that people of all different classes and all different races do not believe in the same principles that are operative in Europe, South America, Asia, Africa. And this is a different place. People come here because it's a different place, and they're not willing in the third century of their existence to give it up. And if we can withstand this dark period in our country, I think that we'll be stronger for it. It'll be a cathartic experience.
One of my favorite quotes from Virgil's Aeneid is, "Fortune favors the brave." And I think it is a time to be brave. I'm curious, though, is there a critical flaw in liberalism that we can exploit, that we can be brave and be triumphant?
Well, there's so many that we'd be here all day, but the first is that liberalism doesn't reflect human nature and human acquisitiveness and self-interest. So if you take a liberal position, if I work in Palo Alto and I hear everybody saying that they do not want school choice and they're for open borders, the Silicon Valley elite then do not want to put their kids in the public schools that used to be very good, though they're swarming to what I would call southern private academies that are sprouting up around the Stanford campus. In other words, there's a contradiction that Obama says that we have to watch out for CEOs, but he doesn't think that applies to him, or John Edwards or Al Gore. All of these people, and look at Al Gore, the avatar of global warming and climate change, and yet he sells a failed cable news station to an anti-Semitic Mideastern authoritarian government who enriches him by the profits from fossil fuels, and he does so in haste to beat capital gains tax increases. And so the flaw of liberalism that we have to point out is that they don't even believe the ramifications of their own ideology because it's contrary to self-interest and human nature. It's hypocritical, in other words.
It definitely is hypocritical, and I've never seen the facts get in the way of liberals' ability to believe their own silliness. In grad school, I often mention to my professors that, Marxism led to the death of 100 million people, and they just don't seem to blink an eye over that. They seem to be under the spell of their own lies. We've got to wrap it up here, but I just want to give the audience a sense of hope, a sense of what it's like to be brave and what we can do to get out there and do the kind of mending that needs to be done to the social fabric.
I think I'll end with the same advice. I would, if I was going to be a little bit more specific, the Republican Party is not the blue blood Eastern aristocrats anymore. That's the Democratic Party. This party is populist. When we talk about gas prices, they've gone up an aggregate of $1 trillion in the last 5 years. We should be saying that hurts us, the average commuter. When we look at illegal immigration, we say this is a Wall Street Journal and La Raza and Democratic elite issue, but it's not for American workers. When we look at the Farm Bill, we should say, yes, we want to curb food stamps, but we don't need corporate agribusiness to get more subsidies. So there are issues that unite the people across the political spectrum, and we need to be populist rather than elitist as our opponents have become.
Thank you so much, Victor Davis Hanson.
Thank you. Philip and Alexander may be thugs, but they surely didn't ask anybody's pedigree when they went to work for them. The question simply was, will you fight, and I'll teach you how to fight in a particular way and give you money in the process. And that is a new idea that capital, technology, military efficacy, all of that, money, mercenaries, are going to be used on the battlefield, whose only arbiter is what works we'll use and what doesn't we won't, and forget about the roles or social pedigrees of anybody involved. And this is the creation of Western warfare as we know it, this horrific enterprise that makes war like no other. I'd like just to finish with a last page to give you some idea that when we talk about tactics and strategy, we're really talking about these 250,000 dead, 500,000 people perhaps were involved in the war, most of whom's names are lost to historical record. So I finish in the last page of A War Like No Other with this. Thucydides sometimes opines that a particular campaign was wise or foolish, but he nearly always adds enough detail to convey to us that the soldiers who believed in the cause for which they were dying deserved commemoration in terms that matched their sacrifice. So one discovers that the Thespians who perished at Delium are not around the next year to save their city, while their allies, the Thebans, tore down their walls. The town of Macalessus loses not merely its schoolboys, but even its animals. And we, his readers, should know that and mull it over. The Athenians are not merely slaughtered at the Asinaris River, but perish as they fight one another to drink the blood and mud of the river. Whereas historians search for messages about the lessons of Thucydides embedded within his text, the general reader has no problem in sensing immediately that his history is about precisely those memorable passages that will never go away, reminding us of the passions and furor that are unleashed on otherwise normal men when they go to war. The young men of Athens on the eve of the initial Spartan invasion are always eager for war, inasmuch as they have had no experience with it. In contrast, quote, the older men of the city, the more experienced, who know something of plagues, assassinations, terror, and sinking triumphs, always are reluctant to invade or attack, and thus often strive to give the enemy some way out during tough negotiations. Thucydides' war can have utility and solve problems, and it often follows a grim logic of sorts, but once it starts, and this is his message, it may well last 27 years over the entire Greek world rather than an anticipated 30 days in Attica, and kill thousands at its end who were not born in its beginning. Such recognition is not necessarily cause for pacifism. Rather, to Thucydides, it calls for acceptance that thousands will end up rotten in little places like the Asinaris River and Aetolia, the logic that follows from decisions made far away in the hallowed assemblies of Athens or Sparta. A wild-eyed Syneletus or sophistic Alcibiades might rouse his volatile assembly to war without good cause, while an Archidamus or Pericles might think that his own sobriety and reason will preclude or even mitigate the killing. But between emotion and logic resides the fate of thousands of the mostly unknown. Astimachus and Lacan executed at Plataea, the Tanaglan Salgines cut down at Delium, Skirophondas butchered at Macalessus, and the Spartan Xenontes who fell at Heraclea, who will surely then and now be asked to settle through violence what words alone cannot. Remember them, for the Peloponnesian War was theirs alone. Thank you very much.